When you walk around a natural history museum and look through the brightly lit glass cabinets at the animals and even fossils on display, what is it that captures your interest the most? Is it the wonder of the natural world, the lives the animals live? Perhaps it's sadness when you realise some species are now extinct. At the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge, a new perspective is taking shape. That of the human story behind how the animals got here in the first place.
All of these collections have human stories, so as well as celebrating the big scientific greats like Darwin and Wallace, we also acknowledge that they didn't work alone and that there's a far greater diversity of people who are responsible for the kind of huge discoveries in the history of science. That these are the collections that Wallace used to understand evolution.
That's Jack Ashby, Assistant Director of the museum, and I'm Lainy Malkani, and welcome to the Collections Uncovered Echoes from the Museum podcast. Over the next 3 episodes, we'll be exploring the human story behind one of the most iconic extinctions of the 20th century, that of the Thylacine, or Tasmanian tiger, its links to the Colonial project against Aboriginal people, and reveal an uncomfortable truth about one of its most prolific collectors. Please be aware that we will be discussing events that involve racial violence in Tasmania. Our journey begins in the museum's public gallery, where I meet Jack, who's about to show me a very special skeleton.
We have about 2 million specimens in the museum overall, but I think there's probably about 3,000 or 4,000 on display. And we're just coming downstairs to where our Australian mammals are. Here is one of our Thylacine skeletons on display.
It's actually smaller than I anticipated.
Yeah, about the size of a small dog. They do get bigger than this one, so this one is 3 feet long, plus the tail. Of course, Thylacines on the outside have stripes, which dogs don't, but otherwise they really look identical.
And I can see here an image of the Thylacine. This is quite an iconic image, isn't it?
Yeah, the photo alongside the specimen is of 2 Thylacines in the zoo. I think that is Smithsonian Zoo in Washington. But Thylacines were kept in zoos all across the world from the 1850s. So the very first Thylacine in captivity anywhere in the world was here in the UK in London Zoo in 1850.
Thylacines were the largest marsupial carnivores of modern times. The last known individual died in a Tasmanian zoo in 1936. However, Aboriginal paintings and carvings on rocks in mainland Australia show that these shy and reclusive hunters existed there until around 3,500 years ago, but they continued to live on the island of Tasmania until very recently. There we find a far more sad and violent story connected to its extinction, one of genocide and of survival. We leave the bright lights of the gallery to a more quieter place where Jack explains the brutal history of colonisation in Tasmania.
Britain invaded Tasmania in 1803, and there was conflict almost immediately with Tasmanian Aboriginal people. Colonists were claiming Aboriginal people's land, and by the 1820s there was periods of martial law, and what was known as the Black War was literally a military campaign waged against Tasmanian Aboriginal people. And from 1830 there was a bounty put on Tasmanian Aboriginal people's heads, so people were actively rewarded for killing or capturing Tasmanian Aboriginal people. Then, shortly after that, there was massive efforts to round up the Aboriginal population and take them offshore to islands in the Bass Strait, where conditions were unsuitable for human health. There wasn't enough fresh water, certainly not enough game to hunt, so people got very, very sick very quickly, and the death rate was astonishing. So it meets all of the definitions of a genocide, what the British did to the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, which obviously continues to have ongoing harm today.
It's estimated at the time that colonisers arrived, around 6,000 Aboriginal people lived in the eastern part of the island where the Europeans settled. 3 decades later, that number was reduced to about 250. In Tasmania, or lutruwita as it's known by Aboriginal people, the memory of those ancestors who were killed and driven from their land is ever present.
My name is Hank Horton. I'm classed as an Aboriginal elder from the Cooperoo and the Yarra Aboriginal mob here in the north of the state. My ancestors have called Lutruwita home for around about 40,000 years. My traditional clan group, through my grandmother's side, was the Trooloolway people of the northeast tip of Tasmania.
Being out in the countryside is where he feels the strongest connection to his past.
So I think that I'm very lucky that I'm able to live the life and have the freedom I have to be able to go back out onto my country, knowing the spirit of the land is still very strong and that I can still practice my old Aboriginal culture, one of the oldest continuing living cultures in the world. I'm able to practice that in small ways, whether it be hunting and gathering, fishing, diving for the abalone and the shellfish here around the coastline of Tasmania. And I think I'm just so lucky that I'm still able to live my culture. My totem, of course, is the wedge-tailed eagle, big and bold, free. It's one of the largest birds ahead of the raptors here in Australia. I'm very fortunate I have that totem, and I love to sit back and watch my wedge-tailies fly overhead. And it's funny because there's one flying overhead even still today. As I'm talking to now, I've got a big wedge-tailed eagle that's flying over across. So I think our spirit knows that I'm talking on country.
Hank works as a consultant for the local government, teaching people about the history and culture of Aboriginal people. Once back home, he explains the delicate balance between the elements, what Aboriginal people call country.
Our culture involved all the elements on Mother Earth, land, water, fire, sea, the ocean, all those types of things. It all came into play. And if you manage them all as a holistic landscape and manage them all together, you could live in harmony with that environment that you was a part of. So our hunting techniques ensured that all animals, birds, plants and everything was respected, and we would ensure that under our Aboriginal cultural law, we followed those stringent rules around what we could take, when we were allowed to take it, how often we were allowed to hunt it, how many we was allowed to take of that particular plant or animal or bird or whatever it may be. We were very stringent and responsible when it came to following those rules within our environment. And of course, as an elder, we were the keepers of that. So we ensured that our younger generations followed those rules and regulations as well. All our teachings was verbal, so we would hand it down through story and what we call song lines. So we would basically speak the rules and regulations. We would tell our young ones about that. And of course, our totems were given to us as very young children in the community. We would be handed our totem. The elders would pass that down, whether it be our grandparents, our parents, or even other prominent elders in our community groups. So those totems will be given to us, and our totem might be the totem of the bush pepper tree. The totem may be the totem of the emu, or the totem of the kangaroo, or even in this space, the totem of the Tasmanian tiger. When you were given that totem, you would need to follow and learn all about that particular item, whether it be a plant or an animal or a bird. You need to learn about that. You need to know everything about that you could possibly find out and learn. If you couldn't learn it from other Aboriginal elders, well, you'd learn it from watching that animal or that bird, and you would learn how often can I eat that animal or eat that bird or harvest the fruit from that particular plant. So those totems become very strong ways of us learning about our environment and how we can manage that to best sustain it for many generations to come.
But preservation was not in the best interest of colonisers. Jack describes their motives as extractive, of labour, land and natural resources. Both Aboriginal people and animals were seen as interfering with this process. Here's Jack again.
It's important to say that the the genocide and the extinction of the Thylacine are not equivalent, but I do think there is a lot to be said about how what was done to both Thylacines and the people followed very much the same pattern, were part of the same historical process of colonisation. And the parallels are quite profound, also in 1830, so the same year that the bounty was put on Aboriginal people, a bounty was put on Thylacines, which then was started off as a private bounty, but then in the 1880s the government added their own bounty to it. So they were both accused of being pests in their own environment, so they were both seen as a hindrance to development of sheep farming industry particularly. And then as their numbers diminished, they were both accused of being too primitive, kind of evolutionarily inferior to what the Europeans brought with them. And that enabled the Europeans to effectively lay the blame of their population crashes onto Thylacines and onto Aboriginal people by saying, they're just not cut out for this modern world. Whereas obviously what that does is ignore the fact that they're literally being shot at or captured and taken offshore.
Despite the colonisers' brutal attempts to remove Aboriginal people from their land, they survived, although in greatly diminished numbers. Unlike the Thylacine, the loss of this iconic species has become an example of modern extinction. Here's Hank Horton again.
I'm sure as my old ancestors was watching that extinction take place and see it hunted with such aggression towards the animal, where my old ancestors didn't have that aggression towards it. Again, to see the European people be very aggressive at hunting that animal, I think my old ancestors must have really seen the shame in doing that. And of course, it didn't take very many years really for it to become extinct, did it? What a shame.
Next time on the Collections Uncovered Echoes from the Museum podcast, we take a closer look at what science and the practices of collectors reveal about the specimens and human remains from Tasmania, and how they built the reputation of so-called men of science.
So here we have our Thylacine skins, which were donated by Morton Alpert in 1869 and 1871. They're dry, so they are not supple in any way. These specimens haven't been tanned, but that's how you make leather soft. Like if we were to knock them, it would be like knocking on thin wood. They're just empty skins. Some of them are folded, but the ears are sticking out in odd directions, the legs are sticking out. We can see the teats on some of the specimens here, so that this female would have had large babies when she died. It's definitely confronting.
Join us again on the Collections Uncovered Echoes from the Museum podcast with me, Lainy Malkani, and Jack Ashby, Assistant Director of the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge.